Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of the United States and the Cold War. In the previous lectures, I've laid the foundation of the Cold War as a battle of ideologies, economies, philosophies, words, and the like. In this lecture, we need to discuss how the Cold War became a clash of militaries as well. And while, of course, World War III itself never broke out openly, there were many proxy wars around the perimeter of the Cold War, and both superpowers spent much of the decades of the Cold War preparing for a World War III that never occurred. So the Cold War was very much a military clash, even if the two sides never fought each other openly. By late 1947 and into 1948, the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan and their various plans were being rolled out around the globe. Much of this implementation required at least some sort of military assistance and coordination, and Truman recognized that the military needed to be much more highly organized than it had been in the early stages of the Cold War. In fact, he had been advocating for a restructuring of the military since the late stages of World War II. He finally got his wish with the National Security Act, which was enacted in July of 1947. It created a major restructuring of the military and intelligence systems of the United States. It created the Department of Defense and a Secretary of Defense, which merged the Army, Navy, and a new Air Force division as well. This would create a much greater coordination between the three elements of the military. It also created the National Security Council, which would become an important advisory council for the president, and as we'll see, becomes very important with just a few years. And it also created the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, which is going to step up covert activities around the world and intelligence gathering. And as most of you would be familiar, and as we'll see in future lectures, spying and spycraft becomes a major part of the Cold War by the late 40s and into the early 1950s. I would also note that creating the Department of Defense, which more or less evolved out of what had been the War Department, establishes a philosophical change in what might as well be a semantic change as well. Because after all, there is a difference between a war and defense. Wars have beginnings and endings, and the War Department, as it had been run, tended to escalate and de-escalate depending on the nature of the conflict. When wars came to an end, War Department activities quieted down. But defense is perpetual, it's permanent. And so by creating a Department of Defense, Truman and the government was recognizing that many of these threats were not going to go away, and that we needed to be ready at any time and at all times for any kind of military activity that might spring up around the world. And as we'll see throughout the Cold War, it becomes very important that our military is prepared and ready at a moment's notice to intervene anywhere around the globe. There is also movement in this time to coordinate international military efforts, leading us towards what will ultimately become the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. In March of 1948, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg signed the Brussels Treaty for Mutual Defense. The nations agreed that they would assist each other if any one of them were invaded. Truman and his advisors applauded the treaty and initiated discussions for the United States to join. Again, this would ultimately lead us toward NATO. By June, the Senate had granted its approval and was beginning to work on a formal treaty. These efforts were interrupted by the presidential campaign of 1948 and events in Germany, which we'll talk about in just a few moments. The newly restructured military establishment that I just described was put to its first major test in 1948 with events in Germany, one of the first real crises of the Cold War. Germany had been a major front in the Cold War from the beginning and would remain so right to the end, with the fall of the Berlin Wall signaling the end of the Cold War. Great Britain and the United States had an interest in restoring Germany and its economy. They wanted to see a relatively strong Germany. France and Russia, who had borne the brunt of World War II, both wanted a weak Germany, and so their interests differed. As we've described in previous lectures, Germany had been divided after the war into 4 different quadrants with zones of control or influence, each for the United States, France, Britain, and the Soviet Union. And the city of Berlin itself, which actually was located deep within the Soviet zone, was also divided into 4. And you can see that represented in this map. And so Berlin became a pocket of what we might call Allied influence deep within the Soviet zone, this little section of American, French, and British influence. With the creation of the Marshall Plan, the growing animosity between the two sides, and the increasing militarization of the Cold War, it was clear to the Soviet Union that the western parts of Germany would contribute to rebuilding and possibly threaten Soviet security on that front. Stalin became determined to act, cutting off Berlin and its more than 2 million citizens from the rest of the world. In June of 1948, the Soviet Union established a blockade around Berlin, blocking entry through all methods on the ground, all roads and railways. The blockade began on June of 24th of that year. Truman's response was quick and unequivocal. "We are going to stay, period," he said. Over the course of more or less the next year, the United States airlifted supplies into Berlin to keep the citizens of West Berlin alive and in good condition. This is known as the famous Berlin Airlift, which lasted 324 days, finally ending in May of 1949. At its height, the airlift lifted in more than 13,000 tons of supplies each day, and at its peak, more than 1,000 sorties or flights flew into West Berlin. They delivered vital supplies such as coal, food, and medical supplies, along with some less vital but still important things like chocolate, which famously some of the pilots began dropping out of the planes as they flew over. And so you have pictures like the one at the bottom of the screen where Berlin citizens would come out and watch the flights and applaud as they flew over. This was a military operation, and it went relatively smoothly, ultimately lifting in more than 2 million tons of supplies in total. Eventually, Stalin and the Soviets recognized that the Americans could keep this up forever if need be. And so in April of 1949, the Soviets began removing the blockade. This was the first direct clash of the Cold War, and while shots were not fired, there were some deaths from planes going down, and it ultimately seemed a United States victory was clear. The Soviets had backed down. Indeed, it was an American victory. They had stood up to the Soviet threat, and they, in this case, had won. However, it also established a somewhat risky precedent going forward, that this would be a method that could always succeed. If there was a threat somewhere, the United States could send troops, enact a military operation, and the other side would relatively quickly and painlessly back down. As we'll discuss in future lectures, the precedent established by the Berlin Airlift might actually have led the United States into some perilous operations where things didn't go quite as smoothly. The Berlin crisis also brought up some questions in the Pentagon and the White House as far as how defense should be orchestrated. During the crisis, some members of the Pentagon actually sought authority for using the bomb to be transferred from the president to the military to use at its discretion. Harry Truman drew the line. I do not intend to have some dashing lieutenant colonel decide when would be the proper time to drop one. Thus, ultimate authority over the atomic bomb remained with the president himself. While the Berlin airlift was in operation, Harry Truman worked through an exhaustive re-election campaign. Foreign affairs, as it turned out, were not really central to the campaign, as most Republicans, including his opponent, Thomas Dewey of New York, agreed in large measure with Truman's approach to diplomacy. As Reinhold Niebuhr put it, for peace, we must risk war. It is to that re-election campaign in 1948 that I'll turn in my next lecture.